Don't call it in. 6 days. 6 days everyone spent looking, and 6 days everyone gave up. Search and Rescue folded their maps that morning. Probability of survival, they said, functionally 0. Then a woman nobody knew anymore walked off the marked trail at dawn. Larkin Briggs found her at first light, curled beneath a granite shelf, lips cracked, a bruise along her jaw that no fall ever made. The missing billionaire, alive, barely. And when Larkin reached for the radio, that dying woman's hand closed around her wrist like a vise. Don't, please. The second that call goes out, they'll know exactly where I am. Who will? Someone in my own company, someone close, someone who wants me dead before I can prove what I found. What Larkin didn't know yet, kneeling in that frozen hollow, was that the same people hunting this stranger had already taken someone from her. 14 years ago.
The wind came down off the ridge like it had somewhere to be. Larkin Briggs heard it before she felt it. That was the first thing her mother ever taught her about mountains. Sound arrives early. Consequences arrive late. And by the time you feel the cold has already made its decision about you. She stood on the porch of the cabin with a mug going lukewarm in her hand and watched the tree line the way other women watched televisions, waiting for something to move that shouldn't. Nothing did, which was the problem. Nothing ever did anymore. 3 years in this valley, 3 years of quiet mornings and quieter nights, and a phone that rang for wrong numbers and prescription refills and nothing else. 3 years of being Larkin Briggs, ER nurse, Bitterroot Valley Regional Shift Lead, competent, well-liked, unremarkable. A woman other women waved to at the grocery store and never once wondered about past the wave. That was the design. That had always been the design. Below the porch, the valley rolled out gray, green, and endless pines stacked shoulder to shoulder all the way to a horizon that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be morning. Somewhere down there, a dog barked twice and gave up. A truck engine turned over, caught idled. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary place, and she'd built her whole life around collecting them the way other people collected coins. Small, safe, countable. Nobody here knew what HM2 meant. Nobody here knew that her hands, the same hands that started IVs and charted vitals and handed out warm blankets to frightened old men with chest pain, had once packed wound cavities with gauze while rounds cracked overhead like the sky itself was angry. Nobody knew. That was the whole design of it. That was the entire architecture of the life she had built, board by board, silence by silence, until the woman standing on this porch bore almost no resemblance to the one who used to run toward gunfire because someone screaming her call sign meant somebody needed her hands more than they needed her fear. She sipped the coffee. Cold now. She drank it anyway, because that was another thing her mother taught her. You don't waste what you already paid for. Not coffee, not training, not grief, if you could believe that, though it had taken Larkin the better part of a decade to understand what her mother meant by it. The porch boards creaked under her weight as she shifted. Old wood, honest wood. She'd chosen this cabin 3 years ago for exactly that reason, because the floor told the truth about where you were standing, and after everything that had felt like the only kind of honesty she still trusted. A hawk cut across the tree line riding a thermal she couldn't see, and Larkin watched it the way she watched everything now. Carefully, from a distance, cataloging without engaging. Old habits didn't die, they just found smaller wars to fight. She finished the coffee, rinsed the mug, left for work before the valley had fully decided what kind of day it wanted to be. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee the same as every morning, and Larkin moved through her shift the way water moves through a riverbed it is carved 1,000 times before. Automatic, efficient, somewhere else entirely. A farmhand came in first mid-morning with a laceration across his forearm deep enough to need 11 stitches, and he watched her hands with the particular fascination of a man who has never seen someone work fast without looking rushed. "You're not from around here," he said, not a question. "I'm from everywhere," she said, which was true. Which was also a door closing before he could knock on it. He laughed like she'd made a joke. She hadn't. She threaded the needle through torn skin with the same unhurried precision she used for everything, counting stitches under her breath out of a habit older than this town, older than this state, older than the version of herself standing in this room. 11. Clean. Done. You ever get nervous? The farmhand asked, flexing his fingers experimentally once she'd taped the last layer. Not about this, Larkin said. About what, then? She didn't answer that one. Some questions you let hang in the air until the person asking forgets they asked them. An hour later, a woman came in with her toddler running a fever of 104, small body burning under Larkin's palm like a coal that hadn't decided whether it was dying or just getting started. And Larkin talked the mother down from panic in the same low, even register she used on everyone. Slow words. No wasted motion. The particular stillness she carried in her chest like ballast, the kind of stillness you don't learn in nursing school, the kind you earn somewhere else, somewhere with sand in it, or altitude, or blood. By noon, she'd also set a dislocated shoulder for a rancher who'd been thrown from a horse and stabilized a cardiac event long enough for the chopper out of Missoula to land in the gravel lot behind the clinic rotor wash, flattening the weeds along the fence line, while Larkin knelt in the dirt doing compressions and counting out loud, because counting out loud kept her hands from shaking, even when nothing else would. The chopper lifted. The patient lived. Nobody clapped. Nobody ever did out here. That was fine. She'd stopped needing the clapping a long time ago. Her supervisor, a soft-spoken woman named Denise, who had never once asked the right questions, caught her in the hallway near the end of the shift, clipboard against her chest like a shield she didn't know she was holding. You ever think about ER lead full-time? Benefits bump? Denise Whitfield paused, studying Larkin with the mild, well-meaning curiosity of a woman who genuinely believed ambition was the only thing standing between people and happiness. You're wasted on part-time, you know that? I like where I am, Larkin said. Where you are is nowhere. Larkin smiled the smile she kept for exactly this purpose, warm enough to end a conversation without starting one. Exactly, she said. Denise laughed, not understanding the joke, and moved on down the hallway with her clipboard and her benefits packet and her entirely reasonable belief that a good life was built from more, not less. There was one more patient before the shift ended, an old man, 70-something, gray stubble and trembling hands, brought in by his daughter because he'd fallen in his garage and wouldn't say why he'd been out there at 6 in the morning in November in the first place. Larkin checked him for a concussion, found none, and noticed instead the tremor that had nothing to do with the fall. Parkinson's, probably undiagnosed, the kind of thing a man his age might spend years quietly hiding from a family that loved him enough to worry and not enough yet to ask the hard question out loud. You should see a neurologist, she told him gently, writing a referral in handwriting steadier than her own hands had any right to be. Soon. Not because anything's an emergency, because the sooner you know what you're dealing with, the more choices you get to keep. He looked at her for a long moment, something knowing in his rheumy eyes. You talk like someone who's had to find things out the hard way, he said. Everyone finds things out the hard way, eventually, Larkin said. The lucky ones just get more warning than the rest of us. He didn't ask what she meant. She was grateful for that. Some kindnesses were made of restraint. Larkin clocked out at 5, drove the 22 minutes home with the windows cracked, cold air cutting in around the frame radio, off because the silence had become its own kind of company over 3 years. The mountains changed color as the sun dropped gold, sliding into rust, sliding into the deep bruised purple that meant the valley was closing up for the night. And she watched it the whole drive, the way some people watched sunsets on vacation. Like it was something she still had to earn the right to enjoy. The knock came at 6:47 that evening. She knew the time because she was staring at the stove clock when it happened, waiting for water to boil for pasta she wasn't especially hungry for, and the knock arrived like an intruder into a room that had agreed silently to remain empty. 2 knocks. Pause. 1 knock. Her whole body went still before her mind caught up to why. Because nobody knocked like that by accident. That was a pattern. That was a code baked so deep into muscle memory that civilians never even noticed they were doing something wrong when they didn't do it. 2, pause, 1. A door knock in Morse, if Morse only had 2 letters, and one of them meant, "I'm a friend," and the other meant, "Let me in before someone sees." She hadn't heard that knock in 6 years. The pot on the stove kept boiling behind her, forgotten water hissing over the lip and onto the burner while she crossed the kitchen on feet that had gone silent without her telling them to, had already balanced on the balls of her feet before she consciously decided to open the door at all. Marcus Reyes stood on her porch in a government gray jacket that fit him worse than his old uniform ever had, hands loose at his sides, the posture of a man trying very hard to look like he wasn't a threat, which, of course, made him look exactly like one. He'd aged. Not badly, just honestly the way men age when the job keeps taking small pieces of them and never gives any back. Gray at the temples that hadn't been there before. A tightness around the eyes she recognized because she saw it in her own mirror some mornings right before she talked herself out of looking too long. "Hey, Doc," he said. Nobody had called her that in 6 years either. "You're supposed to be dead," she said, which wasn't fair, which also wasn't entirely a joke. "Funny," Reyes said. "I was about to say the same thing about you." She let him in, not because she wanted to, because leaving him on the porch would have required an explanation, and explanations were currency she didn't spend anymore. Behind her, the pot boiled over. She turned off the burner without looking at it, muscle memory doing the small chore while the rest of her attention stayed locked on the man standing in her kitchen like 6 years and 400 miles hadn't happened at all. He sat at her kitchen table like he belonged there, which irritated her more than it should have, and he set a manila folder down in the space between them with a care that told her exactly how much weight it carried before she'd read a single word inside it. "I'm not doing this," she said. "You don't know what this is." "I know the folder. I know the jacket. I know the knock." She crossed her arms. "I know you didn't drive 4 hours into the middle of nowhere, Montana to catch up on old times." Reyes exhaled through his nose, a tired sound, older than his face. "Woman went missing 6 days ago," he said, "hiking alone in the Bitterroots. Search and rescue called it this morning. Terrain's too rough, weather's turning. They're saying she's dead." Larkin said, "Just say it. They're saying probability of survival is functionally 0. Silence sat down at the table between them like a third guest nobody invited. "Then she's dead," Larkin said. "I'm sorry, I mean that. But I'm not SAR. I'm not Coast Guard. I'm not anything anymore, Marcus. I hang IVs for a living now." "You know that terrain. I knew that terrain 12 years ago. You mapped it. For training. You and your mom before—" "Don't!" The word came out sharper than she meant it to. Sharp enough that Reyes actually flinched, actually pulled back an inch, like he'd touched something hot and good. Let him flinch. Some doors you keep locked because of what's behind them, not because you're weak, because you already know exactly how strong the thing on the other side is, and you have made your peace with never testing it again. Reyes was quiet for a moment, long enough that the refrigerator hum filled the space where his voice had been. Then he opened the folder anyway, slid a photograph across the table like a card in a game she hadn't agreed to play. A young woman, sharp cheekbones, dark hair pulled back, the kind of face that belonged on a magazine cover except her eyes carried something magazine covers never do. A flicker of fear caught mid-frame, like whoever took this photo had captured her 1 second before she ran. Genevieve Ashford Reyes said, 25, CEO of Ashford Dynamics. You've probably seen the name. Defense contracts, aerospace components, half the county's proud. She built the company out here instead of on a coast somewhere. Larkin didn't touch the photo, didn't need to. Something in her chest had already tightened at the name Ashford, though she couldn't place why. Not yet. Not consciously. Just a small, cold pressure behind her sternum, the kind she'd learned a long time ago not to ignore, even when she couldn't name it. She went up alone, Reyes continued. No permit filed, no trail companion, no explanation to her staff, just gone. Security cameras caught her leaving the compound at 4 a.m. Nobody's heard from her since. CEOs don't hike alone into a mountain range in November without a reason, Larkin said. No, Reyes agreed. They don't. She looked up at him then. Really looked. And something in his face told her this wasn't the whole story, wasn't close to the whole story. What aren't you telling me? Reyes hesitated, which was answer enough. Marcus. There's chatter, he said finally. Internal. Somebody inside her own company might have wanted her gone before she went missing. I can't say more than that. I shouldn't have said that much. Then why did you? Because you're the only person left alive who's walked that section of the Bitterroots off trail. Because the map they're using for the search grid, the one SAR just abandoned, that map has your mother's handwriting on it, Larkin. She drew half those routes herself. The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, the wind picked up again. Larkin could hear it moving through the pines like something searching. Don't, she said again, quieter this time, not a warning, closer to a plea. I know what I'm asking. You don't, you can't, because if you did, she stopped herself, swallowed the rest of the sentence before it could escape and become a thing she'd have to live with having said out loud. Reyes waited. He'd always been good at waiting. It was, in its own strange way, the most dangerous thing about him. He'd waited her out in worse rooms than this one once, and both of them knew it. 14 years, Larkin finally said. 14 years I've kept my mother's name out of my mouth. And you drive 4 hours to put it back in. I didn't have a choice. Everybody has a choice. Not when a woman's dying on a mountain, they don't. Larkin walked to the window, stared out at the dark line of trees swallowing the last violet light of dusk. Her own reflection ghosted faintly over the glass superimposed on the tree line like a photograph, double exposed, and for a moment she wasn't sure which version of herself she was looking at. The nurse, the daughter, the thing she used to be before either of those words existed. 14 years. 14 years since the knock at a different door, in a different life, a different version of herself who still believed the Navy kept its promises. 14 years since two officers in dress uniforms had stood on her mother's porch with faces arranged into the specific, practiced blankness reserved for delivering news that ends a world. Master Chief Larkin Briggs, killed in action, classified operation, details unavailable. That was it. That was the whole explanation Larkin ever got. Details unavailable, as if her mother's death were a redacted paragraph in somebody else's report, instead of the exact center of her daughter's entire life collapsing inward like a dying star. She was 13. She remembered the uniform creases on the officer's sleeves more clearly than she remembered his face. She remembered the specific shade of blue in the flag they folded and pressed into her hands 3 weeks later at a funeral with a closed casket because there hadn't been enough of her mother left to open one, and nobody had ever explained to a 13-year-old why that was either. Details unavailable had apparently applied to everything. She remembered standing in the front pew in a black dress 2 sizes too big, borrowed from a neighbor because nobody had thought in the chaos of those 3 weeks to buy her one that fit, and thinking, with the strange flat clarity children sometimes have in the middle of the worst days of their lives, that this was the last time anyone would ever fold something for her mother again. And she remembered, with a clarity that still made her hands cold even now, the last conversation she'd had with her mother 3 weeks before the knock. Rosalind packing gear at the kitchen table, humming something under her breath, glancing up at her daughter with that particular look she saved for moments she considered important. Someday, you'll go up a mountain and somebody's life depends on what you know, her mother had said. Doesn't matter if you're wearing a uniform when it happens, what matters is whether you show up. Larkin hadn't understood it then. She was 13. She thought it was just something mothers said, the way mothers said eat your vegetables or don't stay out past dark. A rule with no teeth. A sentence meant to fill silence more than to be believed. She understood it now. Standing at a window in Montana with a case file behind her and a dead woman's daughter's photograph face up on her kitchen table, 14 years and one whole abandoned life later. Except Genevieve Ashford wasn't dead, not yet. Reyes had said, probability of survival is functionally zero, which, in Larkin's professional experience, translated to something closer to nobody's checked hard enough to know for certain. Zero wasn't a number she trusted anymore. Zero was a number people used when they were tired, when budgets ran out, when helicopters needed refueling somewhere warmer, when a search had gone on long enough that continuing to search became more expensive politically and financially than declaring it finished. She'd seen zero before. She'd seen zero become something else entirely once, on a rooftop, in a place she didn't let herself think about, when a man everyone had already written off in their heads opened his eyes at the sound of her voice and asked her in a language she'd had to relearn fast whether he was going to die. She'd told him no. She'd been right. Zero was not a fact. Zero was a decision other people made because continuing to search was harder than stopping. She turned around. "Show me the map," she said. Reyes's shoulders dropped half an inch, relief carefully contained. "I knew you." "Don't," she said a third time. "Don't say you knew. You didn't know anything. You hoped. There's a difference, and out there, the difference gets people killed." "Copy that," he said quietly, and for the first time since he'd walked through her door, he almost looked like the man she remembered, instead of the tired stranger who'd replaced him. She poured 2 cups of coffee, neither of them had asked for because her hands needed something to do, and set one in front of him without a word. Reyes wrapped both hands around the mug like it was the first warm thing he'd touched in days. "You ever think about us?" he said, not looking up. "The old unit, where everybody landed?" "No," Larkin said, which was a lie and they both knew it, and neither of them called her on it because some lies are just kindness wearing a disguise. "Delacroix's teaching high school chemistry in Ohio," Reyes said anyway. "Married, 2 kids, sends a Christmas card every year with a dog and a Santa hat on it. Ochoa's still in made chief. Winters—" He stopped himself. "Winters didn't make it home," Larkin said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Winters didn't make it home," Reyes confirmed. 3 years after you got out. Different op, different mountain, different country, but I still think about it sometimes. How thin the line is. How it's mostly luck in the end, dressed up as skill so we can sleep at night." Larkin's throat tightened around something she didn't have a name for yet. "I didn't know." "Why would you? You made sure nobody could find you to tell you." It wasn't an accusation. It landed like one anyway. "That's not fair," she said. "No," Reyes agreed. "It's not. I'm sorry. I've had a long 6 days and I'm tired, and I forgot for a second that the version of you sitting across this table earned the right to disappear." Larkin looked down at her coffee, watched the steam curl and vanish. "I didn't disappear because I stopped caring, Marcus. I disappeared because caring almost finished the job the war didn't." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said finally. "I think that's actually why I drove 4 hours to knock on your door instead of calling. I needed to see for myself that you were still in there." Under all this, he gestured vaguely at the cabin, the quiet, the whole careful architecture of her borrowed peace. "I needed to know the disappearing didn't take all of you." "It didn't," Larkin said, quiet, certain, for the first time all evening. "It just took the parts I was tired of carrying." Reyes almost smiled at that. Almost. The map spread across her kitchen table looked exactly like she remembered, except it didn't. The paper was newer, the coordinates updated, printed in a crisper font than the pencil her mother used to carry, but the bones of it, the ridgelines, the ravines, the dry creek beds that flooded without warning every spring, those were her mother's, unmistakably drawn in the careful, economical hand of a woman who had never wasted a single line. Larkin would have known that handwriting, blind in the dark with her eyes closed. Some things get burned into you deep enough that even grief can't sand them away. Larkin's finger traced a route without her permission, memory, moving faster than conscious thought, tracing the switchbacks up, past the old fire lookout, toward a shelf of exposed granite that offered the only true windbreak in a 6-mile radius. "There," she said. "If she's alive, if she had any survival training at all, that's where she'd go." Sargrid didn't cover that quadrant because Sargrid follows trail logic. Ashford didn't file a trail plan, which means she wasn't hiking, she was running. Reyes looked at her with an expression she didn't like. Too close to admiration. Running from what? That's your department, Larkin said. Mine is finding her before the cold finishes what somebody else started. Reyes studied the map a moment longer, then looked up at her, and something in his voice softened when he spoke again. For what it's worth, I hated asking you this. Then why'd you ask? Because I hated the alternative more. A woman dying up there alone because I was too much of a coward to knock on a door I knew would hurt to open. He shrugged, small-tired. I chose the door. Larkin didn't answer that. There wasn't a version of an answer that wouldn't have cost her something to say out loud. Reyes left a little after 9, promising to meet her at the trailhead before dawn, and the cabin went quiet again in a way that felt different now. Not empty. Occupied by something invisible that had been sitting in the corner of every room she owned for 14 years, patiently waiting for her to finally look at it. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, boots by the bed, and stared at the ceiling while her mind ran laps around a mountain she hadn't set foot on in over a decade. Somewhere past midnight, she gave up pretending sleep was coming and sat up, pulling a battered wooden box out from beneath the bed. She hadn't opened it in 3 years. The hinges complained about it, a small, dry shriek in the dark that sounded absurdly like an apology. Inside, a folded flag triangle, pressed edges gone soft with handling. A photograph of her mother in dress whites, laughing at something outside the frame, caught in a moment of pure, unguarded joy that Larkin had spent years trying and failing to remember the context of. And beneath both of those, wrapped in an old cloth, her mother's field kit. The same one Rosalind carried on every deployment, every training exercise, every mountain she ever mapped. Larkin unwrapped it slowly, the way you'd unwrap something that might still be alive. Trauma shears. A tourniquet, still sealed. Expiration date, 14 years expired and completely irrelevant. A compass whose glass had cracked sometime in a life Larkin would never fully know the details of. And a small leather notebook, pages swollen with old moisture, filled front to back with her mother's handwriting. She didn't read it. She never read it. Reading it felt like opening a wound that had only ever pretended to close. But she held it against her chest for a long moment in the dark, and something in her breathing shifted, slowed, steadied. Okay, she whispered, to no one, to the room, to the ghost of a woman who taught her that showing up was the whole point of everything else. Okay, one more time. She packed the field kit into her own bag before she could talk herself out of it. Trauma shears first, then the compass, its cracked glass catching lamplight like something alive. The tourniquet she left useless now, but she wrapped it back in its cloth anyway and set it gently in the box, because some things you don't carry, you just carry the memory of. Last, almost as an afterthought, she picked up the leather notebook again, turned it over once in her hands. The spine had cracked long before it ever came into her possession, and the cover smelled, even now, faintly of wood smoke and gun oil. A combination that shouldn't have been comforting and somehow impossibly still was. She didn't open it. She told herself the way she always told herself, that tonight simply wasn't the night. There would be other nights. There had been 13 years of other nights already, and she had wasted every single one of them on the same small, cowardly postponement. But she slid the notebook into the outer pocket of her pack instead of back into the box, and that, for Larkin Briggs, was as close to progress as 14 years of grief had ever gotten her. She closed the box, slid it back under the bed, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark for the 2 remaining hours before her alarm was due to go off. Not sleeping exactly, but not entirely awake either. Somewhere in that gray middle place, she thought she heard her mother's voice again, faint, almost imagined, saying the same 6 words she'd said 1,000 times growing up. You don't leave people on the mountain. She'd never once in 13 years since managed to leave that sentence behind either. Dawn broke gray and reluctant over the bitter roots, the kind of light that hadn't fully decided whether it wanted to exist yet. Larkin moved through the trailhead parking lot with the economy of motion she hadn't used in years, checking gear with hands that remembered a rhythm her mind had tried very hard to forget. Trauma kit, water, thermal blanket, rope. Her mother's compass, clipped now to her own pack because some things you carry not for function, but because leaving them behind feels like a second kind of dying. The air smelled like frost and pine sap and something colder underneath, both a smell she associated viscerally with every worst morning of her adult life. Her breath fogged in front of her. Somewhere above the ridgeline, the sky was doing its slow gray-to-gold negotiation, undecided, the way mountains always were about giving anything away for free. Reyes waited by his truck, watching her with the particular wariness of a man observing a machine he wasn't sure still worked correctly after years of disuse. "Last chance to back out," he said.
You said that already. I'm saying it again because I mean it more the second time.
Larkin shouldered her pack, looked past him up toward the tree line where the mountain waited, indifferent and enormous and entirely uninterested in whether she was ready. "She's got maybe hours left," Larkin said. "Not days. Hours. So either walk with me or get out of my way." Something crossed Reyes's face. Not quite a smile, closer to recognition. "There she is," he murmured. "There who is? The woman who scared the hell out of half of Coronado." Larkin didn't answer that, didn't have anything left over to spend on it. She started walking. The mountains swallowed her within minutes, the way mountains always do to the people foolish or brave enough to disturb them. The terrain climbed fast, faster than Larkin remembered, though she suspected the mountain hadn't changed. She had. 3 years of soft ground and hospital floors had cost her something, and she felt the cost in her calves within the first mile and her lungs by the second, a burning she welcomed almost gratefully because it gave her something simple to focus on besides everything else crowding the inside of her skull. Because this was different from every hike she'd taken since Montana became home. This wasn't recreation. This was a clock ticking somewhere she couldn't see, counting down toward a number that only mattered because a stranger's life was attached to it. She checked her watch. 0640. 6 days missing. Overnight lows in the 20s. No confirmed shelter, no confirmed supplies, no confirmed anything, except a photograph of a frightened woman and a mother's handwriting pointing toward granite. Larkin moved faster. Behind her, Reyes kept pace with the grim determination of a man who'd trained for endurance in different terrain entirely, and every so often she heard him mutter something under his breath that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse, and honestly, out here there wasn't always a difference. Which was when she saw the first sign. Not a footprint. Something smaller, easier to miss, exactly the kind of detail search parties following trail logic would walk straight past without a second glance. A single thread of blue fabric caught on a branch at chest height, fluttering like a tiny flag surrendering to nobody. She crouched, examined the angle of the snag, the direction the branch had bent. Northeast, off the marked trail entirely, toward the ravine nobody official had bothered to search because nobody official believed a woman in expensive hiking boots would willingly leave the path. Except somebody running from something doesn't think about paths. Somebody running thinks about cover, about distance, about every tree between herself and whatever she's afraid is following. Larkin's pulse kicked up, not from exertion this time. She didn't get lost, Larkin said out loud, mostly to herself. Reyes, several yards behind, caught up, breathing hard. What? She wasn't hiking, she was running, and people running don't leave a trail by accident. They leave it because they're moving too fast to be careful. She turned northeast, off the marked path, toward the ravine. The mountain, indifferent as ever, let her pass. By mid-morning, the terrain had turned brutal granite shelves stacked at angles that punished every wrong step, and Larkin moved across them with the low, controlled crouch of someone whose body remembered danger even when her mind tried to insist there wasn't any. Reyes struggled behind her government training, clearly built for different terrain than this. "You're going to kill me before the mountain gets the chance," he called. "Then keep up. Some of us didn't spend our childhoods memorizing granite. Some of us don't have a choice about what our childhoods were." That landed harder than she meant it to. Reyes went quiet. Larkin kept climbing, and something in her chest tightened again, an old ache resurfacing at the worst possible moment, the way old aches always do. Because this was her mother's terrain. Every foothold, every angle of stone, every gap between the trees where sunlight cut through in narrow blades. Her mother had walked this exact ground with a pack twice the size of Larkin's, teaching a girl who didn't yet know she'd need any of it. Watch your footing before you watch the view. The view will still be there. Your ankle won't forgive you if it isn't. Larkin's boot found a hold. Her mother's voice told her to find 3 seconds before her conscious mind processed the terrain at all. She stopped for half a breath at the sensation of it, the eerie, familiar comfort of a dead woman's instincts moving through her daughter's living body, like water finding its old channel. She stopped, breathed, kept moving. They stopped for 90 seconds beside a boulder the size of a truck, long enough for water and a strip of jerky Larkin didn't taste so much as fuel with, and in that small silence, her mind wandered somewhere she usually didn't let it go during daylight. A rooftop. Heat that had weight that pressed down on you like a hand. A man's voice panicked, calling a name that wasn't hers, but might as well have been, because out there, names stopped mattering as much as whether you showed up when they were called. She'd shown up. She always showed up. It was, she sometimes thought, the only part of her mother she'd inherited without question. The one piece of inheritance she'd never once tried to return. Reyes caught her staring at nothing and didn't ask. That, too, was its own kind of mercy. An hour later, they crossed a shallow creek, water so cold it burned through her boots, and on the far bank, Larkin found a broken twig bent at an angle that told her with the same certainty she'd trust a pulse reading that somebody had crossed here recently, moving fast, favoring one leg slightly more than the other. "She's hurt," Larkin said, crouching over the print pressed into the mud beside the twig. "Left leg. Ankle, maybe, or a fall." "How do you know that?" "Because her right stride is longer. She's compensating." Reyes stared at the print like it might rearrange itself into something he could understand on his own. "You got all that from a footprint." "I got all that from a footprint and 11 years of reading the ground for a living," Larkin said. "Come on, she's close." They found the second sign near noon, a crushed energy bar wrapper wedged beneath a rock in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental, not dropped, hidden. "She's hiding evidence of her own trail," Larkin said, turning the wrapper over in gloved fingers. "That's not panic behavior. That's training, or instinct sharp enough to look like training." "Ashford's CEO of a defense company," Reyes said. "Doesn't mean she knows fieldcraft. Doesn't mean she doesn't." They pushed on. The ravine narrowed walls of granite rising higher on either side, funneling the wind into a low, constant moan that made conversation feel like an intrusion. Larkin's eyes swept the terrain in the pattern her mother taught her decades ago, near, far, always circling back, never trusting a single glance to catch everything. The light shifted as they climbed, thin winter sun sliding behind a bank of cloud that hadn't been there an hour ago, and somewhere above them the wind picked up, a fresh, sharper edge that Larkin's body recognized before her mind did. Weather coming. Not immediately. But soon, and soon was a word that meant something different at 9,000 feet than it did anywhere else. She checked the sky the way her mother taught her, reading the color at the edges instead of the center, the way you'd read a person's eyes instead of their mouth if you wanted the truth. Gray-white flattening toward the peaks. 6 hours, maybe less, before the first real snow of the season came down off this ridge and buried whatever they hadn't found by then under a foot of white that wouldn't melt again until spring. "We need to move faster," she said. "Define faster. Define how much you want to live," Larkin said, and didn't wait to see if he found it funny, which was how she saw it. A shadow beneath an overhang that didn't quite match the geometry of stone around it. She stopped, held up a fist. Reyes froze behind her old training kicking in despite years away from any uniform. "There," Larkin whispered. A hollow tucked beneath a granite shelf half concealed by deadfalls someone had dragged into place with what looked like deliberate, exhausted care. A shelter. built by someone who knew at some primal or trained level that visibility meant vulnerability. Larkin's heart began to hammer in a way it hadn't in years. "Ashford?" she called. Voice pitched low, controlled the exact register she used in every trauma bay she'd ever worked. Calm enough not to startle, loud enough to be heard. "Genevieve Ashford, can you hear me?" Silence. The wind moaning through granite. Nothing else. "She's not answering," Reyes said. "That doesn't mean she can't hear us." Larkin moved closer, slow, deliberate, the way you approach an animal that might bolt or might already be past bolting entirely. She crouched at the mouth of the hollow, pulled the deadfall aside with careful hands, each movement slow enough to announce itself because the last thing a half-conscious, terrified woman needed was to wake to sudden motion and mistake rescue for the thing she'd been running from. And there, curled in a space barely large enough to contain her, wrapped in a torn emergency blanket gone silver dull with dirt and frost, was Genevieve Ashford. Alive, barely, lips cracked, cheeks hollowed, a bruise blooming dark along her jaw that told a story no accidental fall could explain. Her eyes were closed. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven pulls that Larkin's trained ear registered as hypothermic, dangerously so, the kind of breathing that had maybe hours left in it, maybe less. "She's alive," Larkin breathed. Something cracked open in her chest, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Relief, sharp and enormous and entirely unprofessional. "Reyes, radio it in. She's alive. We need extraction." "No!" The word came out as barely more than a rasp. Ashford's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto Larkin's face with an intensity that seemed to cost her everything she had left. "No," Ashford repeated, weaker this time. Her hands shot out, fingers closing around Larkin's wrist with a grip far stronger than her condition should have allowed. "Don't. Please, don't call it in. You're hypothermic. You need immediate, not the radio." Ashford's eyes moved past Larkin, past Reyes, scanning the tree line with a terror that had nothing to do with cold. "Not official channels, please. Please, you have to listen to me." "Okay." Larkin kept her voice level, the way she'd been trained to, the way that had talked down panicked patients on battlefields half a world away. "Okay, I'm listening. But you need warmth first. You need—" "They'll know," Ashford whispered, and her voice cracked on the word. Cracked wide open into something raw and terrified. "The second that radio call goes out, they'll know exactly where I am." "Who will?" Ashford's grip tightened. Her eyes, glassy with exhaustion and cold, held Larkin's with a desperation that silenced every professional instinct in her body and replaced it with something colder, something that felt horribly like recognition. "Someone in my own company," Ashford breathed. "Someone close. Someone who wants me dead before I can prove what I found." The wind moaned through the granite walls around them, low and constant, indifferent to the two women crouched in its path and the terrible, fragile thing passing between them. Reyes crouched beside them both, radio still holstered, silent, waiting for Larkin's word, the way he used to wait for it a lifetime ago. In rooms neither of them talked about anymore. He didn't ask what they should do. He simply waited. And that, more than anything he could have said out loud, told Larkin exactly how much trust 6 years and 400 miles hadn't managed to erode. "Okay," Larkin said, mostly to herself, mostly to the mountain, mostly to a woman 14 years gone who had taught her, without ever meaning to, exactly how to kneel in weather like this and refuse to let go. "Okay. We do this quiet." She began working before she'd finished deciding to, hands on Ashford's pulse count silent and automatic, fingers checking for the worst of the damage beneath the blanket, cataloging injuries with the flat, practiced calm of someone who had done this in far worse light, under far worse conditions, for people whose names she'd never learned in time to remember them. And Larkin Briggs, kneeling in a frozen hollow on a mountain her mother once mapped, felt the last 14 years of careful, deliberate silence begin quietly and irreversibly to crack. The old fire lookout hadn't held a fire in 30 years, but it still held shelter. 4 walls, a door that stuck, a wood stove nobody had lit since Larkin's mother used to drag her up here in October just to practice. Larkin remembered this room in flashes, a 10-year-old version of herself sitting cross-legged on this exact floor while Rosalind demonstrated how to splint a fracture using nothing but a broken branch and a torn shirt sleeve. The smell of wood smoke and cold metal, her mother's voice patient in the particular way that only comes from someone who has decided deliberately that patience is a discipline worth practicing on purpose. You won't always have the right supplies, baby girl. You'll have what's around you and what's in your head. Learn to trust the second one more than the first. She hadn't thought about this room in years. Standing in the doorway now with a dying stranger in her arms, she felt 14 years collapse into something closer to a single held breath. That was where Larkin brought her. Not the hospital, not the road. Not anywhere with a signal strong enough to send a location pinging out into the world like a flare. Because a radio call meant coordinates, and coordinates meant somebody somewhere could triangulate a dying woman's exact position on a mountain. And Larkin had learned a long time ago, in a different life under a different sky, that you don't hand a hunter the map. So she carried Genevieve Ashford the last 400 yards herself. Reyes didn't argue, which surprised her. 6 years apart, and he'd apparently learned exactly when to trust her judgment without needing it explained, a kind of faith that felt in this moment almost undeserved. "You're sure about this?" he said instead, watching her lay Ashford down near the cold stove, watching her strip away wet layers with hands that moved fast and clinical and completely without hesitation. "I'm sure she dies if I don't. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant." She didn't look up. Didn't have time to look up. Ashford's skin was the color of old candle wax lips gone past blue into something grayer, and her pulse under Larkin's fingers fluttered thin and fast, like a bird that had already decided which way it was going to fly. Core temp first. Always core temp first. She peeled off the ruined emergency blanket, wrapped Ashford instead in 2 dry layers from her own pack, then her own jacket on top of that, because body heat mattered more than dignity, and dignity could wait until the shivering came back. Larkin worked through the assessment the way she'd done it 10,000 times before, hands moving faster than conscious thought could keep pace with. Airway clear, breathing shallow but present, pulse thin, thready, climbing slowly as the body remembered it still had a job to do. She checked the ankle Ashford had been favoring on the trail, found it swollen but not broken. Wrapped it anyway, because swelling, untreated at altitude, had a way of becoming something worse by morning. She checked the bruise along the jaw, pressed gently at the edges, catalogued the shape of it with the flat, clinical eye of someone who had learned a long time ago that injuries told stories people were often too frightened to tell themselves. This one told a story about a hand. Not a fall. A hand, open, moving fast, connecting hard enough to bruise but not hard enough to break. Someone had hit her, recently, deliberately. Larkin didn't say that part out loud, not yet. There was a time for questions, and a time for simply keeping a person alive long enough to answer them, and right now she was squarely in the second category. Shivering was good. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. "Come on," Larkin murmured low, the exact register she used over every gurney she'd ever knelt beside. "Come on, fight me on this. I need you to fight me." For a long, terrible 30 seconds, nothing. Then Ashford's whole body convulsed into a shiver so violent it rattled her teeth. Larkin exhaled like she'd been the one drowning. "There she is," she whispered. Reyes got the stove going with wood scavenged from a lean-to out back, and the little room filled slowly with warmth that felt, after the mountain, almost obscene in its kindness. Larkin sat back on her heels, watched color creep degree by degree back into a stranger's face. Watched the specific, quiet miracle of a body deciding cell by cell that it was allowed to keep living after all. She had witnessed that particular miracle more times than she could count in far worse places than this one, and it had never once stopped feeling like something close to sacred. And thought about the word Ashford had used before she passed out again in the hollow. Someone in my own company, someone close. Larkin had heard those words before. Different mouth, different mountain, 14 years dead and buried under a folded flag and a redacted report that said in total, in its entire complete accounting of a woman's life and death, details unavailable. She hadn't let herself think it in the ravine, too busy, hands too full of someone else's survival to make room for her own ghosts. But now, in the quiet, with the fire ticking and the wind outside finally losing its argument with the walls, the thought arrived anyway, uninvited, the way the worst thoughts always do. What if this was the same someone? Which was insane, which was grief talking, not evidence, which was exactly the kind of leap her mother used to warn her about back when Rosalind Briggs still had a voice to warn her with at all. Don't let the wound do your thinking for you, baby girl. Wounds lie. They tell you the whole world is the thing that hurt you. Her mother had said that once, years before the knock sitting on the tailgate of a truck after a training exercise that had gone sideways in some minor, forgettable way, watching her 14-year-old daughter nurse a bruised ego more than a bruised body. Larkin hadn't understood it then either. She'd been too busy being furious at herself for a mistake that, in hindsight, hadn't mattered at all. But she remembered her mother's face in that moment, patient, in a way that wasn't soft exactly, but wasn't hard either. A patience that had been earned, not given. You'll want to see patterns everywhere someday, Rosalind had told her. Because when something hurts you bad enough, your mind starts looking for the shape of it in everything else. That's not weakness. That's just how brains protect themselves. But you have to learn to ask the pattern to prove itself before you believe it. Every time, no exceptions. Even when it's convenient, especially when it's convenient. Larkin pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her own sternum, breathed, let it go. Except it didn't go, not all the way. It just moved somewhere quieter and waited. Ashford woke for real a little after 3 in the afternoon, not gradually, all at once, the way people surface when their body has decided survival is no longer in question and it's safe to be afraid again. Her eyes snapped open, found the ceiling, found the stove, found Larkin kneeling 3 feet away with a thermometer and an expression carefully arranged into something neither threatening nor soft. For a moment neither of them moved. Ashford's eyes swept the room in the fast cataloging way of someone trained whether by instinct or necessity to assess a space for threats before assessing it for comfort, exits, windows, the distance between herself and the door, the stranger kneeling close enough to touch her. Larkin recognized the pattern immediately because it was her own pattern, worn into her by a different kind of training, but functionally identical in the end. Whatever this woman had survived on that mountain, it had taught her the same lesson every dangerous thing eventually teaches you. Trust nothing until it's earned. Assess first, feel later, if you can afford to. Where? You're safe, Larkin said. Old fire lookout, off-grid. Nobody knows you're here except me and him. Ashford's gaze cut to Reyes, standing near the door with his arms crossed, and something in her face tightened. Him, I don't know. Marcus Reyes, he said. Federal. I'm the reason she found you. Federal. Ashford's voice cracked on the word. Dry throat, dry fear. No, absolutely not. Get him out. Hey! Larkin's hand found Ashford's shoulder. Not hard, just present. Hey, look at me. You're safe. Nobody's radioed anything. Nobody's filed a location. You have my word. Your word. Ashford laughed, short and brittle and entirely without humor. I don't know you. No, Larkin agreed. You don't. But I climbed 6 hours off trail on a search and rescue grid that already gave up on you, and I carried you the last stretch myself instead of calling it in because you asked me not to. So maybe start there. Something in Ashford's face shifted. Not trust yet, but the beginning of the math that leads to it. She looked in that moment less like a CEO and more like exactly what she was, a 25-year-old woman who had spent 6 days alone in the cold, certain she was going to die, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, been proven wrong. Okay, she whispered. Okay, Larkin said. Now tell me who's trying to kill you. Ashford didn't answer right away, because answering meant saying it out loud, and saying it out loud meant it was real in a way that whispering it half-conscious in a frozen hollow somehow hadn't been. She stared at the fire instead, watched it eat through the wood Reyes had cut, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone flat. Careful. The voice of someone reciting something they'd rehearsed alone at night for a long time, never expecting to say it to another living person. Ashford Dynamics builds guidance components, she said. Aerospace contracts, some defense work. My father built it from nothing, and I took it over 4 years ago when his heart started failing, and I have spent every single day since trying to prove I deserved it.
Nobody doubts that,
Reyes said quietly. Everybody doubts that, Ashford snapped and then seemed startled by her own volume. She softened, barely. Everybody doubts a 25-year-old woman running a defense contractor, which is fine. I earned it anyway. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and for a moment the composure that had carried her through 6 days on a mountain seemed to slip, just slightly, just enough to show the exhaustion underneath.
You want to know the worst part? She said. I used to sit in board meetings and watch grown men twice my age explain my father's own company to me like I hadn't grown up in it, like I hadn't been doing homework at that conference table since I was 7 years old. I told myself if I just worked hard enough, audited hard enough, proved myself thoroughly enough, eventually they'd stop looking at me like an accident of inheritance. She laughed, short and humorless. Turns out proving myself is exactly what got me left for dead on a mountain. What did you find? Larkin said, gently, but not letting the thread drop. Ashford closed her eyes. Discrepancies, she said, in a supply chain audit. Component certifications that didn't match the manufacturing logs. Small, at first. The kind of thing you'd write off as clerical error if you weren't looking hard enough. But you were looking hard enough. I was looking exactly hard enough. Ashford's jaw tightened. Because the certifications belonged to guidance modules, military contracts, and if those modules were failing spec and somebody was falsifying the paperwork to hide it, people die, Larkin finished. Ashford's eyes opened, met hers. People die, she agreed. The fire popped. Somewhere outside, wind found a gap in the wall and whistled through it, thin and cold. Who signs off on that paperwork? Larkin asked. A lot of people. That's the problem. It's not one signature, it's a chain. Compliance, manufacturing, procurement, executive sign-off. Ashford's hands twisted together in her lap. I started narrowing it, quietly, cross-referencing shipment dates against inspection records, pulling contractor invoices going back 3 years, building a timeline nobody was supposed to notice I was building. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my board, not my... She stopped. Not your what? Larkin said. Ashford's throat worked, and for a moment the fire was the only sound in the room. Wood settling, embers shifting, the small architecture of warmth, holding 2 strangers and one impossible conversation together against the cold outside. Not my chief of staff, she said finally. Desmond Cole. He's run my father's office for almost 2 decades. He practically raised me in boardrooms. I trust him more than I trust myself most days. Trust it, Reyes said quietly. Ashford looked at him like he'd struck her. I don't know that, she said. I don't know that yet. Her voice wavered just slightly, the first real crack Larkin had seen in her since the hollow. Desmond taught me how to read a balance sheet before I could legally drive. He sat next to me at my father's hospital bedside for 11 straight hours the night of the heart attack because I was too scared to be in that room alone and too proud to admit it. If it's him, if he's really the one behind this... She stopped jaw working, and for a moment the composed young CEO disappeared entirely, replaced by someone considerably younger, considerably more frightened, sitting cross-legged on a cabin floor with a blanket around her shoulders. I just know that 4 days before I disappeared, I found a locked drive in the compliance server. And the access logs on that drive only had one name on them besides my father's. Nobody said anything. It was Desmond's, Ashford whispered,
And 2 days later, my car had a mechanical failure that my mechanic swears up and down shouldn't have been possible. And the day after that, I told exactly one person I was going hiking alone to clear my head. Cole, Larkin said. Cole, Ashford confirmed. Her voice broke clean in half on the name. The man who taught me how to ride a bike. The man who sat with me in the hospital when my mother... She stopped herself. Larkin's whole body went very still. When your mother what? She said. Ashford blinked like she'd forgotten she was speaking to a stranger, like grief had briefly pulled the words out of a drawer she usually kept locked. My mother died when I was 9, she said quietly. Car accident. Icy road. It wasn't anything sinister, if that's what you're thinking. Just terrible luck on a terrible night. Larkin's pulse thudded once hard against her ribs. What was her name? She asked. Too fast, too much weight behind the question for it to pass as idle. Ashford frowned slightly, confused by the intensity. Margaret. Margaret Ashford. Everyone called her Maggie. Nothing. Larkin exhaled. The name meant nothing. Whatever thread her mind had been chasing, grasping at, desperate to connect two griefs into one shared wound, it dissolved into nothing at all, leaving behind only the faint, embarrassing residue of a hope she hadn't admitted to having, which was almost worse. Because now she just felt foolish. Grief doing her thinking for her again, exactly like her mother warned. I'm sorry, Larkin said. I didn't mean to. It's fine. Ashford looked at her strangely. Why does it matter? It doesn't. Larkin shook her head, forced her voice back into its clinical register. It doesn't matter. I'm sorry. Go on. Tell me about Cole. Ashford studied her for a moment, and something in her expression softened into something less guarded, more curious than suspicious now. You lost someone too, she said, not a question. Larkin didn't answer right away. The fire popped, sending a brief orange flare across the small room, and in that light, she looked, for just a moment, considerably younger than the composure she wore like armor most days. My mother, Larkin said finally. A long time ago. I was 13. I'm sorry. Everybody's sorry. It doesn't fix anything. It's just the thing people say because there isn't anything else that fits in the space where a real answer should be. Ashford almost smiled at that, small and sad. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in about 4 years of executive condolence calls. Grief makes liars out of the kindest people, Larkin said. Not because they mean to lie, because the truth is usually too big to fit in a sympathy card. Something passed between them then, quiet and unspoken. Two women who had each spent years learning to carry loss the way you'd carry something heavy and fragile at the same time, careful never to set it down too hard. But something had shifted in the room. Ashford was watching her now with new attention, the sharp, assessing focus of someone whose entire career depended on reading rooms correctly. You said your name was Briggs, Ashford said slowly. That's right. Larkin Briggs. Yes. Ashford's eyes narrowed, chasing something at the edge of memory. My father has a file cabinet in his study he's never let me touch, locked since before I can remember. I used to think it was just old business records. She paused. There's a folder in there. I saw it once years ago when he thought I was asleep on the couch and he was going through it crying. I've never told anyone that. I don't even know why I'm telling you now. Larkin's mouth had gone dry. What was on the folder? She asked. Ashford held her gaze, and for a moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with mountains or badges or dead mothers, just two women, strangers, 24 hours ago, recognizing in each other the particular loneliness of carrying a secret too heavy to set down and too dangerous to share. Briggs, she said. It said Briggs. The stove ticked. The wind pushed once against the walls and went quiet like even the mountain was listening now. That's not possible, Larkin said, which was a stupid thing to say because plenty of things that feel impossible turn out to simply be things you haven't been told yet. I don't know what it means, Ashford said. I was maybe 11. I never asked him about it. Some things you just let stay locked, don't you? Some doors. The stove ticked softly between them, marking the seconds, the way the mountain outside marked the hours, patient and indifferent both. Larkin thought of a wooden box under her own bed, the folded flag, a cracked compass.
Yeah, she said quietly. Some doors.
Reyes had gone quiet by the door, watching the two of them with the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting one kind of storm and found himself standing in the middle of an entirely different one. He'd known Larkin's history in broad strokes for years enough to know there was a hole in it, shaped like a mother she never mentioned, but he'd never once seen the edges of that hole up close before tonight, and something in his face suggested he was recalculating everything he thought he understood about the woman he'd driven 4 hours to find.
Larkin, he said carefully, you want to tell me what's happening right now?
I don't know what's happening right now, Larkin said, which was true, which was also the most frightened she'd sounded out loud in 14 years. Because her mother's death was classified, redacted, details unavailable stamped across the one document that was supposed to explain the biggest hole in Larkin's entire life. And somewhere, in a locked cabinet in the study of a man whose company built guidance systems for the United States military, sat a folder with her mother's name on it. That wasn't a coincidence. Larkin didn't believe in those. Not anymore. Not since the day she learned that some patterns only look like accidents from far enough away. They didn't get the chance to trace it further that night, because at 9:40 p.m. Reyes's burner phone buzzed once against the wooden table, a single short vibration that in any other circumstance would have meant nothing at all. He looked at the screen. His face changed. Larkin had seen that particular change in a man's face before. It had a specific anatomy to it, the jaw first tightening almost imperceptibly, then the eyes going flat and fast, the way a professional's eyes go flat and fast, right before the professional part of them takes over completely.
What? Larkin said.
I checked in with my handler 4 hours ago, Reyes said slowly. Standard protocol. Confirmed status, no details, just I'm alive, keep the file open. And somebody used my check-in signal to run a location trace. His jaw tightened, which means somebody inside my own agency just pulled a fix on this exact coordinate.
Which means somebody knows where we are,
Larkin finished. Silence. The bad kind. The kind that arrives right before everything gets loud. How long? She asked. If they're close. Reyes was already moving, already pulling his jacket on, already checking the sidearm at his hip with the efficient dread of a man doing math he didn't want to solve.
20 minutes. Maybe less. You said this line was secure. I thought it was.
Something raw crossed his face, guilt arriving fast on the heels of fear. I've used it 100 times, Larkin. I never once, not now, she said, not unkindly. Guilt's a luxury for later. Right now, we move. Ashford, still weak, still wrapped in 2 layers of borrowed clothing, pushed herself upright with visible effort.
They found me, she whispered. They actually found me. Not yet, Larkin said. Not yet, they haven't.
She was already moving, too. Kit repacked, fire doused because smoke was a signal, and signals were exactly what they couldn't afford right now. Compass clipped back to her belt. Her mother's compass. The one with the cracked glass that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation of a piece of 14-year-old field equipment, never once given her a wrong bearing.
Can you walk? Larkin asked Ashford. I have to.
That's not what I asked. I have to, Ashford said again, steadier this time, and something in her voice reminded Larkin briefly, painfully, of another woman entirely. A woman who used to say almost the exact same thing in almost the exact same tone, standing in almost the exact same kind of danger.
So, yes, I can walk.
They went out the back, away from the trail, into terrain steep enough that anyone tracking them would need a very specific kind of training to follow it fast. Larkin had that training. She was betting whoever was coming did too. The thought settled into her stomach like a stone, cold and certain, and beneath it, quieter, a second thought she didn't have time to examine yet. Whoever had sent trained trackers after an unarmed CEO wasn't playing at intimidation. This was an extraction or an execution dressed up as a search party. And the difference between those two things was going to come down entirely to how fast Larkin could think. Which meant this wasn't going to be about outrunning them, it was going to be about outthinking them. "There's a drainage cut 200 yards east," she said low, moving fast with Ashford's arm braced across her shoulders. "Runs down through granite on both sides. Narrow. If we can get through it before they close the gap, it funnels anyone behind us into a choke point I can control." "Control how?" Reyes said. "However I have to." He looked at her in the dark. Really looked. And something passed between them, old and unspoken, a recognition of exactly who she used to be before Montana. Before quiet. "Copy that," he said, no argument left in him. The drainage cut appeared exactly where her mother's decade-old map line said it would, a narrow channel of granite carved by decades of spring runoff, walls rising 8–10 feet on either side, barely wide enough for two people walking single file. The cold had a different quality down here, pressed between stone on both sides, and Larkin felt it settle into her chest like something with weight. Ashford's breathing had gone ragged again, exhaustion and fear doing what the mountain alone hadn't quite managed, and Larkin kept one hand braced against her back the entire way down, steady, silent, a wall between the woman and the dark. They were 40 yards into it when the first flashlight beam swept the tree line behind them. "Down!" Larkin breathed and pulled Ashford flat against the granite wall, her own body angled between the beam and the woman she'd carried off a mountain 12 hours earlier. 3 figures, moving in a spread pattern that wasn't panic, wasn't confusion, trained, deliberate, communicating in short, clipped hand signals that Larkin recognized in her bones before her conscious mind even finished processing them. Because that was a formation. That was a real formation executed by people who had done this before in places far more dangerous than a Montana hillside. Reyes, pressed against the opposite wall, went pale. "Those aren't hired muscle," he whispered. "That's tactical movement. I know what it is," Larkin said. Because she'd used it herself once, a lifetime ago, clearing rooms she wasn't supposed to talk about afterward. The lead figure passed within 15 feet of them, flashlight beams sweeping low across the ground, reading footprints in the frost with a competence that made Larkin's stomach drop. He stopped, crouched, studied a print in the frozen mud that Larkin realized with sick certainty belonged to her own boot. "Contact," he said quietly into a radio clipped at his collar. "Fresh sign, multiple sets, moving toward the drainage." Larkin's hand found the trauma shears in her belt, the closest thing to a weapon she'd thought to bring on what was supposed to be a rescue, not a war. Beside her, Reyes drew his sidearm with hands that shook just slightly, just enough for her to notice. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not to civilians. Not to a nurse 3 years removed from anything resembling combat. Except it was happening. And somewhere, very deep inside her, underneath 14 years of careful, deliberate, quiet, something that had never actually gone anywhere at all, began very calmly to wake up. She thought absurdly of the rooftop again. The heat with weight. Reyes's voice that day, younger, sharper, calling her name the way he'd called it dozens of times since, except that first time it had meant something closer to please. And every time after that, it had simply meant trust. She'd earned that trust the hard way, one impossible afternoon at a time, and she felt it now, solid and certain, in the half-second before her body decided what came next. She caught Reyes's eye, pointed 2 fingers at her own eyes, then toward the lead tracker, then made a small flat gesture with her palm. "Wait." Reyes nodded, barely. Ashford, pressed against the wall between them, had gone completely silent. Eyes huge, watching Larkin with an expression that looked almost like disbelief, like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to be true, even after everything. The tracker straightened, took 2 steps further into the drainage cut, which put him exactly where Larkin needed him. She moved before she let herself think about moving out of the shadow of the granite wall, low and fast, one hand closing over the tracker's wrist as the other drove upward into the pressure point beneath his jaw, with a precision that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with muscle memory that 14 years of quiet had never actually managed to erase.
You went down without a sound.
Which was the entire point. She caught his weapon before it hit the ground, caught his radio before it could crackle a warning to the other two. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were perfectly steady. Both of those things could be true at once. She'd forgotten that. She'd forgotten so much of this. She looked down at the man on the ground, unconscious, breathing, alive, because she'd made a choice about that in the half-second before her hands moved, and something old and complicated turned over in her chest. Not guilt, not quite. Something closer to recognition of a version of herself she'd spent 3 years trying to convince the world and herself no longer existed.
She hadn't missed this. She wanted that to be true more than she'd wanted almost anything in years.
But some part of her, the part that had gone still and cold and perfectly certain in the half-second before she moved, hadn't hated it either. That was the part that scared her most.
2 more,
she breathed, pressing back into the shadows beside Reyes.
East side 30 yards. They'll notice the silence in under a minute.
Larkin? Reyes was staring at her like he'd never seen her before, which, in a way, was true. He'd never seen this version of her, not really, not since a rooftop half a world away that neither of them talked about anymore.
What do you want to do? I want to get her out of here without anyone else getting hurt.
She glanced at Ashford, ashen and shaking against the granite.
Can you two go? Quiet, right now. No talking, no sound, just movement.
Ashford nodded, jaw clenched tight.
Then go,
Larkin said.
Downstream, stay in the water. Where you can, it kills scent and sound both. I'll catch up. You're not staying here alone. I'm buying us 30 seconds.
Larkin's voice left no room for argument.
30 seconds is the difference between them finding a trail and finding nothing. Go.
Reyes went.
Because there wasn't time to do anything else, and because some part of him, the part that used to follow her voice into buildings, neither of them ever talked about afterward, still trusted it completely.
Larkin waited until they'd cleared the bend in the drainage. Then she dragged the unconscious tracker into deeper shadow, checked his pulse out of a reflex she couldn't turn off even now, and searched him with hands that moved fast and clinical, and utterly without hesitation. A radio, a sidearm she left where it was, and clipped to the inside of his jacket where a careless man might have missed it entirely, a small metal badge. Not government issue, not local law enforcement, a private security insignia, stylized letters forming a shape she didn't recognize. FSG. She turned it over in her fingers, frowned, and found etched into the back in letters small enough that she had to angle it toward the faint moonlight to read them at all, a serial number. And beneath the serial number, barely visible, a unit designation that made her blood run colder than the mountain air around her. Because she'd seen that designation before, once, on a single line of a heavily redacted casualty report her mother's commanding officer had shown her briefly years ago before deciding she wasn't cleared to see any more of it and taking it back. She remembered that afternoon in painful specific detail, a cramped office that smelled like old coffee and older regret.
A man in a uniform who couldn't quite meet her eyes, sliding a single sheet of paper across a desk and then almost immediately pulling it back like he'd made a mistake letting her see it at all. She'd caught 3 words before it disappeared. A designation, a date, a location she'd never been allowed to learn the name of. She had spent 14 years trying to forget those 3 letters, and here they were now etched into a piece of metal pulled off the jacket of a man who'd been hunting a wounded woman through granite at midnight. The same unit designation, the same 3 letters, attached somehow impossibly to the exact operation that got her mother killed. Larkin's whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain, because that meant this wasn't a coincidence. This had never been a coincidence. Not the folder with her name in a locked cabinet, not the search grid that just happened to sit on top of her mother's old maps, not any of it. Which meant Genevieve Ashford's nightmare and Larkin's oldest, deepest wound
were not two separate stories that happened to collide on a mountainside by chance. They were the same story. They had always been the same story. She didn't have time to feel the full weight of that yet, didn't have the luxury, because somewhere behind her a radio crackled with a voice asking for status, and a man on the ground wasn't going to stay unconscious forever, and 30 seconds had already stretched into nearly a minute. She pocketed the badge, rose, ran. She caught up to Reyes and Ashford 400 yards downstream, both of them soaked to the knees, both of them shaking from cold and adrenaline in roughly equal measure. "You're bleeding," Ashford said, staring at Larkin's hand. Larkin looked down, a shallow cut along her knuckles. She hadn't even noticed acquiring it. "It's nothing." "Nothing," Reyes echoed, disbelieving. "You just took down a trained operator with your bare hands in under 10 seconds, and you're telling me it's nothing." "I'm telling you we don't have time to talk about it." Larkin kept moving, forcing the pace, forcing her voice to stay level, even though her mind was still catching up to what she'd found in that man's jacket. The weight of the badge in her pocket, heavier than any piece of metal that size had any right to be. "We need somewhere off every map. Somewhere even my mother never drew. Does somewhere like that exist?" Larkin thought of the old ranger cabin 2 ridgelines over the one nobody used anymore because the access road had washed out a decade ago. The one she'd stumbled onto by accident during a solo hike her first year in Montana and never told a single living soul about. "Yeah," she said. "It exists." The last 2 miles passed in near silence, 3 exhausted bodies moving through timber gone black and silver in the last hour before dawn, breath-fogging boots finding purchase on frozen ground by feel more than sight. Ashford stumbled twice. Both times Larkin caught her before she hit the ground, an arm looping under her shoulder, without a word exchanged. The kind of wordless coordination that usually took people years to build, and that the two of them had somehow assembled in under 24 hours out of pure necessity. Reyes brought up the rear sidearm never far from his hand, checking their back trail every few hundred yards with the methodical discipline of a man who had decided somewhere in the last several hours that he wasn't going to lose either one of them tonight. Not after everything. Not after, finally, after 6 years, getting to see the version of Larkin Briggs he used to trust with his life. They reached it an hour before dawn, exhausted, frozen, alive. Larkin barred the door, checked every window, and only then, only once, she was certain, as certain as anyone could be on a night like this one, that they were safe, did she finally let herself sit down. Her hands, she noticed distantly, had started shaking. Delayed, that was normal. That was the body cashing in on adrenaline it hadn't been allowed to spend in the moment. Reyes took first watch by the shuttered window without being asked, sidearm resting across his knees, eyes fixed on a tree line he could barely see in the dark. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Some habits, once relearned, simply reassembled themselves without discussion. Ashford watched Larkin from across the small room, wrapped in a blanket, color slowly returning to her face. "You've done that before," she said quietly. "What you did back there. That wasn't the first time." "No," Larkin said. "Where?" Larkin was quiet for a long moment. "Places I don't talk about," she said. "Same as your father's locked cabinet, I imagine." Ashford flinched but didn't argue the comparison. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped both arms around them, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, letting the fire Reyes had started in the small stove do the talking instead, crackling and popping in the particular language fires use when people don't have words left of their own. "Can I ask you something?" Ashford said eventually. "You can ask. Why'd you really come back up that mountain? Reyes could have found someone else, some active SAR contractor with better gear and less history." Larkin considered the question longer than it probably deserved. Outside, the wind pressed once against the shuttered window, testing it and let go. "Because somebody once told me showing up was the whole point of everything else. I spent 3 years telling myself that didn't apply to me anymore. Turns out I was wrong." "That's not really an answer. It's the only one I've got tonight," Larkin said, and something in her tone closed the subject gently enough that Ashford let it go. Larkin pulled the badge from her pocket, set it on the table between them the same way Reyes had set that manila folder down 2 nights ago. A small object, carrying far more weight than its size suggested. "I found this on one of them," she said. "FSG. Mean anything to you?" Outside somewhere, far off, an owl called once and went silent, the sound swallowed almost immediately by distance and cold. Ashford didn't seem to notice. Her whole focus had narrowed to the small piece of metal on the table, the way a person's focus narrows around the one object in a room that might finally explain everything. Ashford leaned forward, studying it. Her face went slowly, carefully blank in a way that told Larkin she recognized it immediately and was deciding in real time how much to say. "Ferrum Solutions Group," she said finally. "Private security contractor. My father's used them for executive protection for almost 15 years. The room went very still, still enough that Larkin could hear her own pulse in her ears, still enough that the small crack and settle of the fire sounded for a moment unbearably loud. 15 years, Larkin repeated. Give or take. Ashford's eyes lifted, met hers, and something in them had changed, sharpened. Why does that matter to you, specifically? Larkin looked at the badge, at the unit designation etched into its back that matched letter for letter a line in a report she'd only been allowed to see once briefly before it was taken away from her. Because I think your father's company has been connected to my family a lot longer than either of us knew, she said quietly. And I think it's time somebody finally opened that locked cabinet. Ashford nodded slowly, and in the firelight her face looked older than 25, older than the 6 days she'd spent surviving alone, aged by the particular weight of a truth she hadn't asked for and couldn't now refuse. Tomorrow, she said. We go tomorrow, together. You're in no shape to walk into your father's compound. I'm in no shape to sit here and wonder anymore either. Ashford's voice was steadier than it had any right to be given everything. You climbed a mountain in November for a stranger because a dead woman taught you to. I think I owe you at least the courage to walk through my own front door. Larkin looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Okay, she said. Tomorrow. Outside, the first gray light of dawn began slowly to climb the ridgeline, pale and thin, the color of something not yet decided. Larkin sat with her back against the cold wall, watching the light change through the gap in the shuttered window, and let herself feel for just a moment the full shape of what the last 24 hours had cracked open in her. 14 years of careful architecture, 14 years of small rooms and quiet shifts, and a life built entirely out of not looking too closely at anything that might look back. All of it undone by a badge the size of a quarter and a folder with her mother's name on it sitting in a locked cabinet 4 ridgelines away. She thought of her mother's voice again, worn smooth by 14 years of remembering it. Someday you'll go up a mountain and somebody's life depends on what you know. She hadn't known back then that the mountain would eventually lead her back to the very truth she'd spent a lifetime running from. Neither of them slept. Dawn found them still awake, still staring at a badge on a table like it might rearrange itself into something less impossible if they looked long enough. It didn't. Not even a little. FSG, Ferrum Solutions Group, 15 years attached to Ashford Dynamics, and a unit designation stamped into the metal that Larkin had seen exactly once before on a single, redacted line in a report somebody took out of her hands before she'd finished reading it. She'd stopped believing in accidents the moment she found that badge. Reyes had fallen into an uneasy half-sleep sometime around 5, sidearm still resting across his knees, chin dropping and jerking back up every few minutes in the particular rhythm of a man who refused to fully surrender to exhaustion even when his body demanded it. Larkin let him rest. He'd earned that much, and there wasn't anything productive 2 exhausted people could do that one alert person couldn't do just as well in the meantime, watching the pale square of window slowly brighten from black to gray to something that almost resembled morning. Ashford, across the small room, hadn't slept at all. She sat with her knees drawn up, staring at nothing, occasionally glancing at Larkin with an expression that had shifted sometime in the last few hours from wariness into something closer to alliance. "You didn't sleep either?" Ashford said quietly when the silence had stretched long enough to need breaking. "Couldn't, because of the badge." "Because of everything," Larkin said. "The badge is just the part I can hold in my hand. Everything else is still too big to fit in a hand or a room or a single morning like this one." And she was done not tracing this one. "We need the cabinet," Larkin said. Ashford looked up, hollow-eyed, wrapped in a blanket that had gone from life-saving to simply necessary sometime around 4 a.m.
"What cabinet?" "Your father's, the locked one, the one with my mother's name in it." "You want to break into my father's study. I want the truth. If it's in a cabinet, then yes, I want to break into your father's study." Reyes, slumped in the corner with his sidearm across his knees, laughed without any humor in it at all. "Because that's not insane." "Insane is 3 armed men tracking a wounded CEO through granite at midnight," Larkin said. "This is Tuesday, by comparison." Ashford's hands twisted in her lap. "My father's compound has cameras," she said. "Guards, FSG guards, Larkin. The same people who—" "I know who they are." "So you understand why walking in the front door isn't exactly—" "We're not walking in the front door." Ashford stared at her. "Then how—" "You're the CEO, Larkin said. "You have a badge, a code, a reason to be in your own father's house at any hour you please." "I disappeared 6 days ago. If I walk through that gate, whoever's behind this knows immediately I'm alive." "Good," Larkin said. Silence. The kind that makes people reconsider who they're trusting. "Good," Reyes repeated. "They think she's dead, which means right now tonight is the only window where we have the advantage of surprise." Larkin's jaw tightened. Once she's confirmed alive to anyone official, that window closes. "So we use it, tonight, before Cole or whoever's running this has time to clean up whatever's in that cabinet." Ashford was quiet for a long moment, studying Larkin's face like she was trying to read a language she'd only just started learning. "You're not doing this for me," she said finally. Not an accusation, just a fact laid gently on the table between them. "No," Larkin admitted. "Not only. Then who—" Larkin's throat tightened. "My mother," she said. "She died on a mission nobody would explain to me. 14 years, and the only answer I ever got was 2 words. Details unavailable." Her voice cracked just slightly, just enough to be real. "I think your father knows what those details are. I think he's known the whole time." Ashford's eyes glistened. "Then let's go find out," she said. They reached the Ashford compound a little before 11 that morning, Reyes driving a truck borrowed from a rancher 3 ridge lines over, who owed him a favor he'd never fully explained. The drive gave Larkin time she hadn't wanted. 45 minutes of highway and switchback road with nothing to do but watch the valley slide past the window and think about every version of this morning that could go wrong. She'd rehearsed confrontations before, once a lifetime ago, in briefing rooms with maps and contingencies and a chain of command standing behind her. This time, there was no chain of command. There was a truck, a wounded CEO, a federal agent running on fumes, and a 14-year-old wound about to be either finally closed or torn open in front of witnesses. Ashford sat in the back seat quiet, watching the same scenery with an expression Larkin recognized because she'd worn it herself more times than she could count. The particular stillness of someone bracing for a door they weren't sure they wanted opened. Outside, the pines gave way gradually to scrub oak and dry hills as the elevation dropped, the landscape shifting the way it always did on the long drive down from the mountains until Montana felt like a different country entirely, rather than a state they'd left behind that same morning. "Whatever's behind that cabinet," Ashford said eventually, not looking away from the window. "It's going to change how I see my father, isn't it?" "Probably," Larkin said. There wasn't a kinder true answer available, and she'd decided somewhere on that mountain that this woman deserved true answers over kind ones. "And you're still going to make me watch him say it?" "I'm not making you do anything," Larkin said. "But I think you already know
You'd never forgive yourself if you let me walk in there alone." Ashford didn't argue. She just nodded once and went back to watching the window. The gate was exactly as intimidating as Larkin expected. 12 feet of iron and stone, a guard booth manned by 2 men whose posture gave them away as FSG before their uniforms did. Beyond the gate, the compound itself sprawled across manicured acreage, all glass and stone and quiet money, the kind of place built specifically to announce that nothing bad could ever happen inside its walls. Larkin had learned a long time ago to distrust places that worked that hard to look safe. Ashford rolled down the window herself. "Ms. Ashford," the guard's face went slack with disbelief. "We thought. I know what you thought," Ashford said, voice steadier than Larkin had heard it since the mountain, since the hollow, since any moment in the last 6 days that Larkin had personally witnessed. "I need to see my father. Now." The guard hesitated, reached for his radio. "Don't," Larkin said sharply, leaning across. "Don't call it in. If you alert anyone before she's inside that house, I promise you will regret it for the rest of your very short career." The guard looked at her. Something in her expression must have carried enough weight because his hand froze halfway to the radio. "Open the gate," he said instead to the booth beside him. It opened. Walter Ashford was in his study when they walked in unannounced, and the look on his face when he saw his daughter alive, upright, breathing, was not the look of a guilty man. It was the look of a man who had spent 6 days dying by inches and had just, without warning, been handed his life back. The study itself struck Larkin as she crossed the threshold. Dark wood shelves lined floor to ceiling with books that looked red rather than decorative. A wall of framed photographs documenting 4 decades of a company's rise, and beneath all of it, in the far corner, a locked filing cabinet that looked, against the polish of everything surrounding it, deliberately, almost defiantly, plain. As if the man who owned this room had built an entire kingdom of achievement specifically to distract from the one drawer he couldn't bring himself to empty. "Genevieve." His voice broke completely on her name. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that made Larkin look away briefly out of respect for something too raw to witness uninvited. God, you're alive! You're alive! I thought—" "I know what you thought," Ashford whispered against his shoulder. "Dad, I need you to tell me the truth, right now, about everything." Walter pulled back, studied his daughter's face, then slowly his eyes moved past her to Larkin standing in the doorway, and something in his expression changed entirely. He went pale. "You," he said, "you look exactly like her." Larkin's whole body went still. "Like who?" she said, though she already knew the answer, already felt it, arriving before he said it, the way she'd felt the mountain wind before she felt the cold. Something in the set of his jaw, the sudden unsteadiness in a man who a moment ago had looked entirely composed, told her this wasn't a passing resemblance he was reacting to. This was a ghost. "Rosalind?" Walter Ashford said. His voice had gone thin, ancient, cracked open by 14 years of something he'd clearly never told a single soul. "Rosalind Briggs." The room went very quiet. "You knew my mother?" Larkin said, the words landing heavier than she'd expected them to. 14 years of wondering, finally arriving at a person who could actually answer. "I served with her." Walter sank into the chair behind his desk like his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up. Before Ashford Dynamics, before any of this, I was Navy intelligence. She was the best combat medic I ever worked alongside, and I mean that without a shred of exaggeration. He looked at Larkin, then really looked the way a man looks at a photograph he's spent years avoiding. "She used to talk about you," he said quietly. "Not often. Operational security mostly, but sometimes, on the long nights, she'd mention her daughter back home, learning to read topography maps at the kitchen table like other kids learned multiplication tables. She was so proud of you. I remember thinking even then that you'd grow into someone formidable. I didn't expect to meet you like this. Not after everything I did to make sure I never would." Larkin's eyes burned. She refused to let them spill.
Then tell me what happened to her, she said. Tell me why she's dead, and why your company's private security has a unit designation that matches the one on her casualty report.
Walter closed his eyes.
Because I sent her into that operation, he said.
And because it was compromised from the inside, and because for 14 years I have carried the guilt of both those facts alone since the day I was ordered to bury the truth under a classification I never had the authority to challenge. He opened the locked cabinet himself, hands shaking. 14 years of a promise finally catastrophically breaking. Inside a folder, exactly as Ashford had remembered from childhood, edges gone soft with handling that suggested Walter had opened it far more often than he ever let anyone see. He set it on the desk, slid it toward Larkin. "Everything," he said. "Everything I was never allowed to tell you. I kept it. I told myself it was for accountability. Really, I think it was penance." Larkin's hands trembled as she opened it. Photographs, mission logs, heavily redacted, but not so redacted that she couldn't parse the shape of the operation underneath the black bars. Her mother's name, appearing again and again alongside a unit she'd never heard mentioned in 14 years of careful official silence. There was a photograph near the bottom of the stack, curled slightly at the corners from years of handling that stopped her cold. Her mother, younger than Larkin had ever known her, standing in a doorway somewhere overseas, dressed in fatigues, laughing at something outside the frame with an ease Larkin barely remembered from the woman who came home, tired and careful and increasingly quiet, in the years before she died. She'd forgotten her mother had ever laughed like that, freely, without calculation. She set the photograph aside carefully, the way you'd set aside something that might shatter if handled wrong. And a name, circled in red ink that had faded but never fully disappeared. Desmond Cole. "Cole," Larkin breathed. "Your chief of staff. He was there. He was my logistics officer." Walter's voice had gone hollow. "Brilliant. Loyal, I thought. Until the operation your mother led went sideways in a way that never should have been possible given the intelligence we had going in." "What happened?" Walter's jaw worked silently for a moment. "Someone leaked the extraction route," he said finally. "Someone inside our own chain gave the opposition exact coordinates and exact timing. Your mother's team walked into an ambush that should have been impossible. She got 6 of her 7 people out alive." His voice cracked. "She didn't get herself out." He pressed a hand over his eyes, and for a moment he wasn't the imposing founder of a defense empire at all. Just a tired old man carrying a weight that had finally, after 14 years, become too heavy to hold up alone. "I read the after-action report so many times I could recite it in my sleep," he said. "I still can. Every word of it. She held the perimeter alone for 11 minutes so the rest of her team could reach the extraction point. 11 minutes, Larkin. I've spent 14 years wondering what those 11 minutes felt like for her, and I've never once let myself finish that thought." Larkin's breath left her in a single shuddering exhale. "Was it Cole?" she whispered. "Was it him?" "I suspected." Walter's eyes were wet now, 14 years of guilt finally finding a place to land. "I never proved it. The investigation was buried above my clearance level within a week. I was told to stop asking questions or lose everything I'd built. I chose everything I'd built." His voice broke completely. "God forgive me, Larkin. I chose the company over the truth." He looked down at his own hands, spread flat on the desk in front of him as if searching them for some evidence of the man he used to believe himself to be. "I told myself I'd make it right eventually," he said quietly. "Find a way to get you the truth without destroying everything Rosalind's sacrifice had supposedly protected. I kept telling myself, eventually, for 14 years. Eventually never came. It took my own daughter almost dying to force my hand, and I am ashamed more than I can put into words that it took that much." Ashford, standing frozen by the door, looked between her father and Larkin with an expression caught somewhere between horror and a terrible dawning clarity. "That's why," she whispered. "That's why the audit findings scared someone enough to try to kill me.
Because I wasn't just uncovering a compliance issue. You were uncovering the same cover-up,
Larkin said slowly, pieces sliding into place with a clarity that felt almost violent.
the same falsified paperwork, the same unit, the same—
Cole, Ashford finished. It's always been Cole.
As if summoned by his own name, the study door opened. Desmond Cole stood in the doorway. 60-something, silver-haired, dressed in the kind of understated tailoring that whispered decades of quiet, competent power. His face, when he saw Genevieve Ashford alive and upright in her father's study, did not show relief. It showed calculation. Larkin watched that calculation happen in real time, watched the muscles around his eyes and mouth perform the choreography of a man deciding in the space of half a second exactly which version of himself this room required. It was, she thought, the most practiced kind of deception. Not lying with words, lying with the whole architecture of a face. Genevieve. His voice was warm, practiced. Thank God, we've been searching for— Stop, Ashford said, and something in her voice had gone glacial. Stop talking. I know. Cole's expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second. But Larkin had spent a career reading faces in the worst moments of people's lives, and she caught it. Know what, sweetheart? Cole said carefully. Don't call me that. Ashford's hands were shaking, but her voice held steady. I know about the falsified certifications. I know about the locked drive. I know my access logs on that drive only had one name besides my father's. Cole's eyes moved slow and deliberate to Larkin. And who is this? He said. Too calm. Far too calm. Larkin Briggs, she said. Daughter of Rosalind Briggs. I believe you two have history. Something in Cole's face went very still. For a long moment, nobody in the room breathed. Rosalind's daughter, he said finally, quietly. You've grown up. You knew her. I served alongside her for 6 years. His voice had softened, and horribly it sounded almost sincere. She was extraordinary. Genuinely, the finest medic I ever— You leaked the extraction route. Larkin's voice cut through his like a blade through gauze. You gave up the coordinates. You got her killed. Cole's calm cracked just slightly, just enough to see the fear underneath it. That's not— He stopped, started again. You don't understand what that operation actually was. Then explain it, Walter said, rising from his chair. 14 years of guilt, hardening suddenly into something closer to fury. Explain it to me, Desmond, right now, after everything, after all these years. Cole's shoulders sagged, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, he looked less like a man caught and more like a man finally, exhaustedly laying down a weight he'd carried alone for far too long. I didn't leak the route to hurt anyone, he said quietly. I leaked it because I was being blackmailed. Because 18 months before that operation, I made a mistake in a different theater, a mistake that cost lives, and someone found out, and someone used it against me. Who? Larkin demanded. A contractor, private. The same firm your mountain trackers work for now. Cole's eyes closed. Ferrum Solutions Group didn't start as a security company, Larkin. It started as an intelligence brokering operation, buying secrets from compromised officers desperate enough to sell them. I was compromised. I sold your mother's extraction route to save my own career from a scandal I was too much of a coward to face honestly. He opened his eyes again, and for a moment something like clarity moved through his expression. The particular clarity of a man finally saying out loud a truth he'd rehearsed silently 1,000 times in the dark. They were patient, he said. That's the thing nobody understands about people like that. They don't threaten you once and move on. They keep you on a leash for years, pulling only when they need something, letting you believe the debt is paid until the exact moment it isn't. I thought I was free of them for over a decade. I was wrong. The room had gone deathly silent. I never meant for her to die, Cole whispered. I thought I told myself the operation would proceed regardless of timing. I told myself the leak was just information, not a death sentence. I have told myself that lie for 14 years and I still don't believe it.
He looked up, and for a moment his composure cracked entirely, revealing something raw and old and thoroughly exhausted underneath. "You want to know the worst part?" he said. "I went to her funeral. I stood 3 rows back and watched a 13-year-old girl accept a folded flag for a death I caused, and I told myself I was there to pay respects. I wasn't. I was there to make sure nobody ever looked at me and saw what I actually was. I've spent 14 years since then building a reputation as the most trustworthy man in this company, and every single day of it has been an act of penance I never had the courage to make honest." "And Genevieve?" Walter said, voice shaking with a rage 14 years in the making. "When she found the falsified certifications, when she got too close to the same firm that blackmailed you once, FSG came to me again." Cole's voice had gone flat, resigned, threatened to expose everything. My role in Rosalind's death, the falsified specs, all of it, unless I helped them silence the audit before it went further. I told myself I was protecting the company. Protecting you, Walter. I told myself so many things. "You tried to have my daughter killed!" "I tried to buy time." Cole's composure finally completely shattered. "I never authorized violence. I swear to you, Walter, I never—" "The men in the mountains had FSG insignia," Larkin said coldly. "Real weapons, real tactical training. That's not a bluff, Cole. That's an execution team." Cole's face went the color of old paper. "They went further than I authorized," he whispered. "God help me, they went further than I ever wanted." He sank into the nearest chair, hands pressed against his face, and for a moment the room held nothing but the sound of a man finally completely coming apart under the weight of 14 years he could no longer carry alone. "That doesn't matter now," Walter said, and there was something in his voice that had aged a decade in the last 10 minutes. "It doesn't matter what you wanted. It matters what you did. Rosalind Briggs is dead because of you. My daughter nearly died on that mountain because of you." "I know." Cole's voice broke completely. "I have known it every single day for 14 years, Walter. Every single day." That was when the study's side door opened again, and this time it wasn't remorse that walked through it. It was 2 men in dark tactical gear, weapons already raised, and Larkin recognized the insignia on their jackets before her mind had fully processed the danger. FSG. Cleaning up the mess Cole had just confessed to making. "Everyone stay very still," the lead man said. His voice was calm in the specific, chilling way of someone who had done this exact thing many times before. "Mr. Cole, you should have kept your mouth shut." Cole's face drained of every remaining trace of color. "This isn't what we agreed to," he said, voice shaking. "Nobody said anything about loose ends," the gunman said simply. "You became one the moment you started confessing." Larkin's mind moved fast the way it always had in the worst seconds of her life, cataloging exits, angles, distances, the exact number of feet between herself and the nearest cover. The desk, the window, the distance to the lamp on the side table, close enough to reach in one motion if she needed to, because this was the moment. The one her whole body had been quietly, silently preparing for since the mountain, since the drainage cut, since 14 years ago, if she let herself be honest about it. Every quiet shift at the clinic, every carefully unremarkable day in Montana had all been building without her permission toward exactly this kind of second. "Walter," she kept her voice low, controlled. "Desk. Now." Walter, to his credit, moved without hesitation, dragging Genevieve down behind the heavy oak desk as Larkin's hand closed around the lamp on the side table, the closest thing to a weapon in reach. The gunman's eyes flicked toward her. "Don't," he said. "Whoever you are, don't make this—" She threw the lamp. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't tactical doctrine, it was a woman who had spent 14 years pretending she didn't remember how to fight, using the only weapon in arm's reach to buy 3 seconds of chaos. 3 seconds was enough. Reyes came through the study door behind the gunman exactly on the beat, weapon already up, years of training, finally finding a use worthy of it. The first shot went wide in the confusion, the second didn't. The lead gunman went down. His partner spun, weapon tracking toward Reyes, and Larkin closed the distance in 2 strides, driving her shoulder into his gun arm with a force that sent the weapon skittering across polished hardwood floor. He was bigger than her, stronger on paper, but she'd learned a long time ago from a woman who mapped mountains and packed wound cavities and never once raised her voice doing either, that fights aren't won by the person who's stronger. They're won by the person who commits first, who decides, in the space of half a second, that hesitation is a luxury neither side can afford. They're won by the person who commits first. She committed first. It was over in under a minute. Both gunmen down, one unconscious, one groaning, and disarmed Reyes already zip-tying wrists with the flat, efficient calm of a man whose training had finally, mercifully, been given somewhere useful to go. Larkin's hands were shaking again. Delayed reaction, same as the drainage cut, her body cashing in a bill it hadn't been allowed to submit in the moment. She sat back on her heels for a moment, breathing hard, looking around the wrecked study, the overturned lamp, the scattered folder pages, the 2 men zip-tied on Walter Ashford's expensive rug, and felt something close to disbelief that this was the room she'd walked into just 20 minutes earlier, expecting nothing more dangerous than an uncomfortable conversation. Cole was slumped against the wall, staring at the 2 disarmed men with an expression of profound, bottomless horror. "They were going to kill me," he whispered. "They were actually going to—" "Yes," Larkin said, not unkindly, just true. "That's what happens when you make deals with people who only value you as long as you're useful." Walter Ashford rose slowly from behind the desk, one arm still wrapped protectively around his daughter, and looked at Cole for a long, silent moment. 14 years, he said finally. 14 years I trusted you with everything, my company, my daughter, my grief. I know. You're going to tell the FBI everything, every name, every account, every operation Ferrum Solutions is compromised. Walter's voice had gone hard, final. Not because it saves you, it won't. But because Rosalind Briggs deserves the truth on record, and my daughter deserves to run this company without looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life. Cole's shoulders sagged completely. Yes, he whispered. Whatever you need. Whatever's left of making this right. He looked up at Larkin, then something pleading in his expression that she had no intention of honoring with forgiveness she didn't feel. I know an apology means nothing, he said. I know there isn't a version of sorry big enough for 14 years. But I am sorry. For whatever that's worth to you now. It's worth exactly what you're about to do next, Larkin said. Nothing more, nothing less. Reyes made the call from the study, official channels finally gratefully allowed to exist again now that the danger had a name and a face and zip ties around its wrists. Federal agents arrived within the hour. Then, within 2, the quiet compound filled with the particular controlled chaos of a case breaking open all at once after 14 years sealed shut. Larkin sat on the front steps through most of it, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders without her fully noticing, watching agents move in and out of the house like a story finally being allowed to finish. Reyes found her there sometime in the early afternoon, 2 cups of coffee from a thermos someone had produced from somewhere, and sat down beside her without asking permission. You did good, he said, handing her a cup. I nearly got everyone killed. You kept everyone alive, Reyes corrected. There's a difference, and I think you know it, even if you're too tired right now to admit it. Larkin wrapped both hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. Down the drive, federal vehicles continued to arrive and depart in a slow, methodical rhythm, agents carrying boxes of evidence out of a house that had kept its worst secret behind polished oak for 14 years. 6 years, Marcus. You show up at my door with a photograph and a folder and 6 years disappears like it never happened? That's not 6 years disappearing, Reyes said. That's 6 years finally making sense. I always wondered what happened to the version of you I used to know. Turns out she didn't go anywhere. She was just waiting for a reason worth coming back for. Is that a compliment? It's an apology, Reyes said, for not knocking on your door sooner, For letting 6 years go by because I was scared of what I'd find if I looked too closely at how you were doing. He looked out at the compound, at the federal vehicles and the controlled chaos and the whole unraveling machinery of a 14-year cover-up finally coming apart in the open air. I won't make that mistake again. Larkin didn't answer that directly. She didn't need to. Some promises are better received in silence than acknowledged out loud, where the acknowledging might somehow diminish them. Genevieve Ashford came and sat beside her sometime after the ambulances left, both of them declining transport, both of them needing, apparently, exactly the same thing. Air. Stillness. A moment before the next chapter of their lives began in earnest. "You saved my life," Ashford said quietly. "You saved mine too," Larkin said. "Just took longer to notice." Ashford glanced at her, curious. 14 years of not knowing what happened to my mother. Larkin's voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in longer than she could remember. 14 years of details unavailable stamped over the biggest wound of my life. You handed me the truth, even though it cost you almost everything to do it. I didn't hand you anything. You climbed a mountain and found it yourself. Semantics, Larkin said, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, something that resembled a real, unguarded smile crossed her face. They sat together for a while, watching the compound settle into a new, uncertain order, watching a man in a gray suit lead a handcuffed Desmond Cole toward a waiting car, with the particular gentleness law enforcement sometimes affords the guilty who cooperate. "What happens to the company now?" Larkin asked eventually. "I don't know yet." Ashford wrapped her arms around her knees, looking younger in that moment than her 25 years, and considerably more tired. "I know I'm not going to run it the way my father did. All that silence, all that protecting the institution over the people it was supposed to serve. I watched what 14 years of that cost you. I don't want to be the reason it costs someone else that much. That's not a small thing to decide the day after almost dying." "No," Ashford agreed. "But I think it's the only decision I actually trust myself to make clearly right now. Everything else feels complicated. That one feels simple the way true things sometimes do once you strip away everything that was making them look complicated in the first place." Larkin thought of her mother of 11 minutes held alone at a perimeter so 6 other people could live, and thought that maybe some kinds of clarity only arrive after everything else has been stripped away first.
"For what it's worth," she said, "I think you'll be good at it. The parts that matter, anyway. The parts that actually keep people alive instead of just keeping the shareholders happy." "You don't know that." "No," Larkin admitted, "but I watched you survive 6 days alone on a mountain with a bruised jaw and a locked drive's worth of evidence memorized in your head, refusing to give up, even when every reasonable person would have. That tells me something about how you'll run a company. I trust it." Ashford was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone soft in a way Larkin hadn't heard from her yet. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the mountain, for staying after. For not disappearing the second this was over, the way I think most people would have." "I don't disappear on people anymore," Larkin said. "I used to think that was survival. Turns out it was just a different way of dying slowly. One quiet room, and one unremarkable day at a time until there was almost nothing left of the woman who used to run toward gunfire because someone needed her." 3 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday morning that felt in every important way entirely ordinary, Larkin stood in a small chapel outside Coronado, California, watching a folded flag get presented for the second time in her life. This time the words weren't redacted. Master Chief Rosalind Briggs, posthumously awarded, full honors, finally 14 years overdue for a mission whose true details had at last mercifully been declassified. The chapel was smaller than Larkin remembered funerals being, smaller than the one from 14 years ago at least, though that memory had always come to her distorted, the way childhood grief distorts everything, making rooms feel larger and time feel slower than either had actually been. This room held maybe 40 people, folding chairs arranged in careful rows beneath high windows that let in exactly the kind of gray, forgiving light a day like this one deserved.
Former colleagues of her mother's, most of them strangers to Larkin, their faces creased with the particular solemnity of people who had waited 14 years to finally say a proper goodbye. A few of them approached her afterward, offering fragments of memory she'd never had access to before. Small gifts assembled out of years she'd never been allowed to witness firsthand. She held her mother's laugh like sunlight in that debrief tent, one gray-haired man told her, eyes wet. Another, a woman, Larkin's own age now, said simply, "She talked about you constantly. You were the reason she came home every single time until the one time she couldn't." Larkin stood beside the casket-draped table holding her mother's memorial photograph, and she did not cry the way she'd expected to. She stood the way her mother taught her to stand. Steady, present. There one final time for a woman who had spent her whole life being there for everyone else. Genevieve Ashford stood beside her, having flown down for the ceremony despite a company in the middle of its own upheaval demanding her attention back in Montana. Walter Ashford stood 2 rows back, silver-haired and finally visibly unburdened, having personally ensured through channels only a man of his former rank could access that the declassification moved at the speed it deserved, rather than the speed bureaucracy usually allowed. Reyes stood at the very back of the chapel in dress clothes that fit him almost as poorly as the government jacket had present, because he'd insisted on being present because some debts he'd told Larkin the night before don't get paid off with an apology alone. After the service, Larkin walked alone to the edge of the small overlook behind the chapel where the Pacific stretched gray and enormous toward a horizon that didn't care about any of it. Grief. Justice. 14 years of silence, finally broken. The wind here was different from Montana wind, softer somehow, carrying salt instead of pine. But it moved through her the same way regardless, finding the same old places to settle. She thought of all the versions of herself that had stood at windows and overlooks and porches over the years, watching weather change and waiting for something she couldn't name to arrive. She understood now, finally, what that waiting had actually been. Not paralysis, not cowardice, just a very long, very patient kind of grief, biding its time until it finally had somewhere useful to go. She took her mother's compass from her pocket, turned it over once in her hand. The cracked glass caught the light exactly the way it always had. "You know," she said quietly to the wind, to the water, to a woman who had never once in Larkin's whole life failed to come when it mattered. "I used to think I disappointed you, not on purpose, just by surviving something you didn't. I used to think staying small, staying quiet, staying out of the way was the only way to make that fair somehow. Like disappearing was a kind of penance I owed you." She turned the compass over again, watching the needle settle patient and certain toward true north. "I don't think that anymore," she said. "I think you'd have hated watching me hide. I think showing up for that woman on the mountain was the first thing I've done in 14 years that you'd have actually recognized." "Okay," she said quietly to the wind, to the water. "Okay. I did it. I finally did it." The wind answered the way wind always does, which is to say it didn't answer at all. But for the first time in 14 years, Larkin Briggs didn't need it to. She turned from the overlook and walked back toward the small crowd gathered outside the chapel, toward a woman she'd carried off a mountain who was now, somehow, impossibly, becoming a friend, toward a life that finally, after 14 years of careful, deliberate silence, felt like it belonged entirely to her again. Ashford met her halfway across the small lawn, and for a moment neither of them said anything, just stood together in the thin gray light. 2 women who had entered each other's lives through the worst 6 days either of them had ever lived, and somehow come out the other side with something worth keeping. "What now?" Ashford asked. "Now I go home," Larkin said, "back to Montana. Back to the clinic, probably, if Denise will still have me after I disappeared for a week and a half without explanation." She almost smiled at the thought of that conversation, the particular absurdity of trying to explain any of this to a woman whose biggest professional concern a week ago had been a benefits packet. "And after that?" Larkin considered the question the way she'd learned over the last 3 weeks to consider most things now, slowly, honestly, without the reflexive urge to make herself smaller than she actually was. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I don't think I'm going to spend it hiding anymore. I think that part of my life is finished."
"Good," Ashford said, "because I meant what I said on that mountain. I owe you more than a thank you and a handshake. If you ever need anything, resources, connections, a company with more money than it knows what to do with, you call me. I might take you up on that. I hope you do." They embraced briefly, the particular kind of embrace shared by people who understand, without needing to say it, that some bonds get forged faster in crisis than they would in years of ordinary friendship. The way a single, terrible week can sometimes build more trust than a decade of comfortable, uneventful acquaintance ever could. Then Ashford turned back toward her father waiting by the car, and Larkin watched them go, father and daughter, walking together toward whatever came next for a company finally free of the secret that had poisoned it for 14 years. Dawn, when it came the next morning over the Montana Valley she still called home, arrived exactly the way it always had. Quiet, patient, indifferent to everything except the simple, stubborn fact of showing up. Larkin stood on her porch and watched the light climb the ridgeline, coffee warm in her hands this time, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like she was waiting for anything at all. The valley below looked the same as it always had. Pines, stacked shoulder to shoulder toward a horizon still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. A dog barked twice somewhere down the road and gave up. An engine turned over somewhere below, caught, settled into an idle. The same small, ordinary sounds she'd spent 3 years collecting like coins, small and safe and countable. Except they didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. They felt, for the first time since she'd built this life board by board out of silence, like something closer to a home she'd actually chosen rather than a shelter she'd retreated into. She thought briefly of the leather notebook still tucked in the outer pocket of her pack, unread all these weeks later, and decided, standing there in the cold morning air, that tonight might finally be the night. Not because grief demanded it, because she was curious, for the first time in 14 years, about the woman inside those pages rather than afraid of her. Curiosity, she thought, was a different kind of courage than the one she'd spent 14 years practicing. Quieter, slower, but no less real for being so. She finished the coffee, rinsed the mug, and for the first time in 3 years she didn't need the valley to fill any particular silence for her, because the silence finally wasn't asking anything of her anymore. She felt simply and finely like she was home.